All right, this will be your 1990s terrorism and foreign policy discussion. So it's interesting. It's stuff I oftentimes forgot about being a teenager in the 90s because it's such a blissful time. But there was some terrible acts of terrorism, oftentimes domestic terrorism in this country that rocked this country in the 90s. So without further ado, let's get to it. All right, I'll close all this stuff. Get rid of all of this so you can actually see it. All right, the big game we actually played if you're in my classroom, right? So 90s terrorism, home and abroad, and also foreign policy of the 90s. Okay, so when we say that, we're talking about domestic terrorism here, and also acts of terrorism involved the United States, outside the United States, and also our foreign policy as how we dealt with other nations in the 1990s. All right, so one of the first ones, it's a precursor to 9/11, was the 1993 terrorist bombing of the World Trade Center. All right. What the terrorists were able to do is they took a Ryder rental truck and they packed about 1,200 pounds of fertilizers were placed into this van. This, well, not even van, more like a mover. When you move, think of that all being filled with explosives, and they moved it and they parked it underground. All right, underground parking garage. And the group that did it, the motivation was the United States has continued to support Israel and has not funded Arab countries. So these were Arab terrorists. They wanted revenge. And the Twin Towers are a symbol of American power, American trade, and American control over like economics. So attacking them is what they decided to do as a strike back to the United States. And they planted this massive Ryder truck loaded with explosives underneath. And you can see from the damage here, I mean, it was a powerful explosion. Luckily enough, for in this scenario in 1983, it did not cause enough structural damage for any real major like shakeup of the buildings. They had planned that they thought the explosion would be so powerful that they could bring down the towers from underneath, that the structure would be destroyed, but that didn't happen. Of course, there's a massive investigation by the FBI afterwards, the motives, sort of deconstructing the time scene, and also you start gathering evidence. All right, so that was a major one. Unfortunately, this really sets a playbook for the Taliban in 2001. So that was the first incident that happened. Right? So the next thing we start to look at now are incidents that happen inside the United States, domestic terrorist incidents. And whenever I think of Waco, Texas, I oftentimes think of these two, Chip and Joanne Gaines. You probably think of them too with Waco, Texas. Well, if you were in the 90s, it was a different story. You thought of Waco, Texas, you thought of this. And this incident is going to cause several other incidents in U.S. history involving domestic terrorism. So let's start to break this thing down. 1993, there is this fringe group called the Branch Davidians. It's a very far offshoot of Christianity, extreme associated with it. And this is more or less a cult. Their leader is David Koresh. It's this guy here, all right? So it is a cult. The people believe that he is a leader, that he is like the next coming of Jesus, and they've established this massive compound in Waco, Texas. So here's how things start to unfurl, if you will. The FBI, ATF, and that's alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, and other government agencies had information that the leader, that David Koresh, the self-proclaimed son of God, was stockpiling weapons and brainwashing his followers. There was also suggestion that children under the age of consent were being put in some sexual scenarios. So that is why the FBI, the ATF, and other government agencies, the Texas State Police, show up to, in essence, to knock on the door to check out the scenario because they believe there's something illegal happening. That is their probable cause. Well, this group thought the end of the world was coming. The Branch Davidians thought the Armageddon, the end of times, was coming. They were preparing for it. They thought there'd be a war. They don't like the government. They are staunch believers that the government they thought was evil in the early 1990s. And when ATF and the FBI show up, it is a standoff. It's a shootout. You can go online, look at different videos. You oftentimes see FBI agents on top of this building trying to gain access. And you can see bullets coming through the actual walls, and the Branch Davidians were firing their automatic weapons through the walls. And it's basically a shootout, and then that turns into a standoff. The FBI positions himself around the building, and there's no movement for nearly 2 months. It was all over the news. And then the FBI gets the clearance to go ahead from Janet Reno, who is in charge of the AG, and Janet Reno gives the FBI permission to start breaching the walls. When they start breaching the walls, they've modified tanks, and at the end of the tank, you have this long metal object coming out where the turret usually is, and then there's this massive plate of steel, and it's designed to punch down walls. So the FBI starts going in with tanks and pushing down walls, and that is when the Branch Davidians and David Koresh, they believe they all started to commit suicide by taking pills or either shooting them. And then there's this massive fire that also breaks out. Now, according to the FBI says that the Branch Davidians themselves started this fire, but to people who don't like the government, the people who think the government has stepped too far, they believe the government did this. They started the fire to kill these people off. And this is the start, you start to see 1990s, the dawn of internet, and conspiracy theories abound online afterwards. Even though the forensic evidence said that the people, the Branch Davidians started the fire themselves, people who want an excuse to dislike the government, to view the government in a negative way, it starts to, the dawn of early conspiracy theories that the government planned the destruction of this group. And this happens in 1993, and it's all over the news. And luckily, Chip and Joanna Gaines have kind of rewritten the story of Waco, Texas. But this is the start of some serious domestic terrorism in the United States. So keep this in mind. 1993, there's a lot of internet. This is the early dawn of the internet, and these people, different groups, start talking to each other about a government inside job. Right? So that leads directly to this 2 years later. Oklahoma City federal building bombing, all right, 1995. So the groups start talking online, people start believing that the government is evil, and they start plotting an act of revenge against what happened, for the people that happened in Waco, Texas. All right, so this guy here, Timothy McVeigh, a former Army veteran of the Gulf War, is the individual who is in charge of this assault. He worked with this guy named Terry Nichols. Terry Nichols actually has a connection here to Michigan. He was a right-wing survivalist from Michigan, sometimes often associated with linking up with the Michigan militia. So McVeigh and Nichols are the people who plot revenge against the federal government. And they choose this building here, the federal building, because it's a symbol of federal power. So what they do, they take once again, a rider truck, a moving truck, and they plant it full of fertilizer-based explosives, and they park it right outside the federal building. All right. Now, just some more background before you can obviously see what happens here. There's a few things playing in their minds as to why they're doing it. They want revenge for what happened in Waco. They also see that in the 90s, there's a real push by a Democrat, Bill Clinton, to limit assault rifles. A lot of the limiting assault rifles is born out of what happened at Waco, when those Branch Davidians were able to get assault rifles and fire back and almost outgun the FBI. There's a real push in this country to limit assault rifles against police officers. They don't like that. They think it's an infringement of their Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. And unfortunately, these groups also, you start to see the rise of far-right neo-Nazi influence. So this idea of a white superior race. They don't like the fact that weapons are being taken from them, and especially assault rifles. So you put it all together, and they decide to take action. And unfortunately, they planted this rider truck outside the Trade Center. Right? And you can see the explosion. Here's the before and after. What really shakes me up as you start to deconstruct the time screen, and just the structure of this building, a lot of these individuals who work for the federal government had families, and there was a daycare center that was provided to them. So you have little children who are on the first floor, 19 children on the first floor, and the van was parked right approximately next to it, and it kills those children. And 168 people are also killed as well in this extremely powerful explosion. Witnesses that day oftentimes say that the explosion was so powerful that blocks down from the explosion, the glass would crack and almost shatter, and you felt the explosion from blocks away. That's how powerful the explosion was. As soon as this is done, these two are often are found. This guy will be executed. Timothy McVeigh will be executed in the year 2001. And Terry Nichols, I forget exactly what happens to him, but this is a direct retribution to what happened in Waco, and also their views that the weapons are being taken, the Second Amendment, and it's also the start of this far-right neo-Nazi influence conspiracy theorist internet that's going to kind of be an issue in the country. It starts in the 90s. All right, so it's done exactly on the 2-year anniversary of what happened in Waco out of revenge. All right, so let's start to move this thing. This is the one that really starts to shake a lot of people up. It's been an issue in schools, oftentimes talked about. So let's take a look at Columbine. So Columbine is a high school in Colorado in 1999. And two students killed 12 students. These two students here killed 12 students and a teacher. They wounded 23 others. And it shocked the country. There have been school shootings in the past, but the level of which these two individuals plotted and had control, it really shook the country. I remember in high school looking at kids we put on the television and we watched these kids running out and fleeing the scene, and you'd never seen anything like it. These two kids are oftentimes picked on. They called themselves the trench coat mafia because they didn't fit in with the traditional students. They were kind of bullied. They were outsiders, and they categorically plotted their assault on how to kill the individuals at the high school. Some of the videos that we get training with in our own school is you hear the calls, the phone calls, and one teacher is talking about how she's in a room locked down with her students, and then you hear the two students appear. You can hear them, and then teacher has the phone just kind of live, and the two students are standing over the students, like asking them if they want to live. They're standing on desks, pointing their weapons at the students on the ground. They're asking if they want to live. This really shook up this country. And it's not really until Sandy Hook you start to see this country being shaken by school shootings again. But this shocked the country, this act of domestic terrorism by young individuals who were sadly picked on and bullied. They sought revenge. So that was Columbine. All right, so foreign policy in the 90s is interesting as well. So we've had things happening inside the country, and there's also two different scenarios that emerge, and America really doesn't take any action against what's happening in the world, including a genocide. And there's a lot of reasons why. So let me start to unpack our foreign policy. This looks a lot here. Don't worry about it. I'm just going to give you the basic story. It's pretty simple. In Somalia in 1993, there is a civil war. In essence, there's a war between a warlord and different government groups. And the United States steps in along with the United Nations to really just kind of provide peace and shelter to stop a civil war, to stop the killing of civilians. So let's jump to this point here. The United States, along with the United Nations, decides to go on a mission to take out a prominent warlord. So we take the best, we take the Navy SEALs, we load them on these Black Hawk helicopters. There's a mission to go in to capture the warlord and to, in essence, to take him out. Unfortunately, the U.S. Black Hawk helicopters are heading to take out the warlord. They're spotted by spotters on the ground who have radios, walkie-talkies, and the heads up is given to the warlord to run. And the different militias that are controlled by the warlord are ready for the U.S. attack. They're well armed to these militias. In essence, when these planes start to touch down, the helicopters start to touch down, they're hit by rockets, and several of the Blackhawks actually just spin out of control, land on the ground, and a lot of them, due to their training, are able to fight their way out after several days and get out of there. They're heavily outgunned, heavily out by pure numbers. They're outnumbered. They fight in the middle of the night. They've had little sleep. And some of them are able to get out. Unfortunately, some of the helicopter pilots who crashed down there do not make it out. And on cable news, I remember watching this. They took this American fighter pilot, this helicopter pilot, and they took him out of the helicopter and dragged his body around the streets. And it was caught on camera. caught on video. And as Americans watched in 1993, you start to see this movement, this question of why are Americans dying for the world's problems? Like, we are not the world's police, and that is what some people even view today, that the problems of the world that happen internationally are not U.S. foreign problems. Some people say that we are, that we should intervene in scenarios like this, and some Americans also disagree with this idea. But really, there's such a big blowback that an American dies here in this failed mission that foreign policy, the Clinton administration really starts to say, we're going to scale back. There's a lot of pushback because of this failed mission that happened in Somalia in 1993. If you want to watch a great movie, it's called Black Hawk Down. It's really good. You probably need to get your parents' permission for it, but it'll show you the extreme valor showed by a lot of these Navy SEALs who go into a firefight that they're not going to win, and somehow they make it out. So that's what sets the policy of America really being hands off what's happening in the world in the 90s. So with that in mind, we got to talk about what's happening in Bosnia. So Bosnia is a genocide. And because of Americans' distaste for what happened internationally, we were really hands off, and unfortunately, a genocide occurred. So the backstory in that is Yugoslavia was a country as part of the old Soviet regime. In the 90s, as the Soviet Union's breaking up, Yugoslavia is also breaking up into different areas as well. One of them is going to be Bosnia, one is going to be Serbia, you've also got Croatia. But the big difference is these two groups that have been part of Yugoslavia have not liked each other over their religion for years. They haven't been allowed to practice their religion, and they don't like each other's religion. The Bosnians are Muslims, the Serbians are Christians. Okay? And they're both going to start to fight for who gets the biggest land after the breakup. Unfortunately, the Serbians, the Croats have the biggest military, so they're really going to be in charge. So the general who's in charge of the start of this genocide, this ethnic cleansing, is Slobodan Milosevic. He conducts a genocide against the Bosnians because they are Muslims. The numbers are still climbing even to this day, but about 100,000 Bosnians were murdered in a genocide. They're still digging up the tombs. They're discovering more and more every year, and the number is continuing to grow. They basically killed them off and then buried them in these shallow graves all over Bosnia. Now, the United Nations was trying to step in to stop all this, but it was not working. The United Nations asked for more U.S. intervention, more U.S. troops and supplies to stop this, but because Americans did not like what happened in Somalia, the Clinton administration does not give additional troops to the United Nations. And also the United Nations did a pretty bad job of, obviously, of managing and stopping this as well. So America scaled back. We didn't give too many soldiers to prevent this genocide, right? So like I said here, the U.S. and UN troops were deployed as peacekeepers, but the atrocities still occurred. I've watched different documentaries over the years, and all the Serbians did was, as soon as the United Nations area left, the protective services left, they'd simply move on to a different area that wasn't protected and slaughter the Bosnians there. So, yeah, foreign policy is big. All right, so when we look at what's really the point of this, a lot of our conspiracy theories are really born out of the 90s, the idea of the internet. People questioning the government, the actual motives, and you can just kind of take your pick out there. So, all right, that's the 90s. You're all set for this unfortunate video.